The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 3, The Wood Between the Worlds. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly, and then for a moment everything became muddled. The next thing Diggory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above, and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. "I believe I'm in water," said Diggory, "or underwater." This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upward, and then his head suddenly came out into air, and he found himself scrambling ashore, out onto the smooth, grassy ground at the edge of a pool. As he arose to his feet, he noticed that he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect after being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side, in a wood. The trees grew closer and closer and were so leafy that he could get no glimpse to the sky. All the light was green light and came through the leaves, but there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for the green daylight was bright and warm. It was the quietest room you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards, as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive, and when he tried to describe it afterward, Diggory always said it was a rich place, as rich as plum cake. The strangest thing was that almost before he had looked about him, Diggory had half forgotten how he had come there. At any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly or Uncle Andrew or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened or excited or curious. If anyone had asked him, "Where'd you come from?" he would have probably said, "I've always been here." That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterward, it's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing, and that's all. Well, after Diggory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl on her back at the foot of the tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just between sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing, and at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. And then she spoke in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before." "I rather think so too," said Diggory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least, I don't know. It's been a very long time." "Well, so have I," said Diggory. No, you haven't. I just have seen you come up out of that pond." "Yes, I suppose I did. I'd forgotten," said Diggory. Then for quite a long time neither said anything more. "Look here," the girl said presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I mean, I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head of a boy and a girl like us living somewhere quite different and doing all sorts of things, and perhaps it's only a dream." "Well, I've had the same dream, I think," said Diggory, "about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling around rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face." "Aren't you getting that mixed up? In my dream, it was a boy who had the dirty face." "I can't even remember the boy's face," said Diggory. "Hello, what's that?" "Why, it's a guinea pig," said the girl, and it was a fat guinea pig nosing around in the grass. But round its middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and tied onto it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. "Look, look," said Diggory, "the ring, and look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I." The girl sat up now, really interested at last, and they stared very hard at one another, trying to remember, and then at exactly the same moment she shouted out, "Mr. Ketterly!" and he shouted out, "Uncle Andrew!" and they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes of hard talking, they had got it straight. Diggory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. "What do we do now?" said Polly. "Take the guinea pig and go home?" "Well, there's no hurry," said Diggory, with a yawn. "I think there is," said Polly. "This place is too quiet. It's so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever." "It's very nice here," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "But we've got to get back." She stood up and began to cautiously go towards the guinea pig. Then she changed her mind. "We might as well leave the guinea pig," she said. "It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take it home." "I bet he would," answered Diggory. "Look, the way he's treated us. By the way, how do we get home?" "We'll go back in the pool, I expect." They came and stood together at the edge looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of green, leafy branches. They made it look very deep. "We haven't any bathing things," said Polly. "Oh, we shan't need them, silly," said Diggory. "We're going to go in with our clothes on. Don't you remember it didn't wet us on the way up?" "Can you swim?" "A little bit. Can you?" "Well, not much." "I don't think we'll need to swim," said Diggory. "We want to go down, don't we?" Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into the pool, but neither said to the other. So they took hands and said, 1, 2, 3, go! And they jumped. There was a great splash, of course, and they closed their eyes. But when they opened them again, they found they were still standing hand in hand in that green wood and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool was apparently only a couple inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry ground. "What on earth has gone wrong?" said Polly in a frightened voice, but not as frightened as you might expect, because it's hardly to feel frightened in that wood. The place was too peaceful. "Oh, I know," said Diggory. "Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you." They put on their green rings and came back to the pool, but before they tried another jump, Diggory gave a long, "Oh, what's the matter?" said Polly. "I just got a wonderful idea." "What are all those other pools?" "Well, how do you mean?" "Why, if we can get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mightn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Supposing there was a small world at the bottom of every pool." "But I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world or other place or whatever they call it. Didn't you say—" "Oh, bother Uncle Andrew," interrupted Diggory. "I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked of one other world, but suppose there were dozens." "You mean this wood might be only one of them?" No, I don't believe the wood is a world at all. I think it's just sort of an in-between place." Polly looked puzzled. "Don't you see?" said Diggory. "No, listen. Think of our tunnel in the slates at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses. In a way, it's not really part of any of the houses. But once you're in the tunnel, you can go along it and come out into any of the houses in a row. Mightn't this would be the same? A place that isn't in any worlds, but once you've found that place, you can get into them all." "Well, even if you can," began Polly, but Diggory went on. "And of course that explains everything. That's why it's so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here, like at home. In the houses that people talk and do things and have meals, nothing goes on in the in-between places, behind the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor and in our tunnel. But when you come out of the tunnel, you find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into jolly well anywhere. We didn't need to jump back into the same pool we came up, or not just yet." "The wood between the worlds," said Polly. "It sounds rather nice. Come on, which pool shall we try?" "Look here," said Polly, "if I'm not going to try any new pool till I've made sure we can get back to the old one. We're not even sure if it'll work yet." "Yes," said Diggory, "and get caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken before we've had any fun? No, thanks." well, couldn't we just go part of the way down in our own pool and just to see if it works? And then if it does, we'll change rings and come back up again before we're really back in Mr. Ketterly's study. Can we go part of the way down? Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it'll take a little time going back. Diggory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in any new worlds until she had made sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he was, some dangers, Wasp for instance, but she was not so interested in finding out other things nobody had ever heard before. For Diggory was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up, he became the famous Professor Kirk, who came into other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings. Green for safety, said Diggory, so you can remember, you can't help remembering which is which. And they held hands and got ready to jump. But as soon as they seemed to be getting back into Uncle Andrew's study, or even into their own world, Polly was about to shout change, and they would slip off their greens and put on their yellows. Diggory wanted to be the one that would shout change, but Polly wouldn't agree. So they put on their green rings, took hands, and once more shouted, 1, 2, 3, go! And this time it worked. It is very hard to tell you what it felt like, for everything happened so quickly. At first there were bright lights moving about in the black sky. Diggory always thought these were stars and even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moon. But almost at once there were rows and rows of roofs and chimney pots about them, and they could see St. Paul's, and they knew they were looking at London, but you could see through the walls of all kinds of houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew, very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking at all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before then he became quite real. Polly shouted, change! And they did change, and the old world faded away like a dream, and the green light above grew stronger and stronger till their heads came out of the pool and they scrambled ashore. And there was the wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. There, said Diggory, that's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one. Stop, said Polly. Aren't we going to mark this pool? They stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Diggory had just been going to do. For there were any number of pools in the wood, and the pools were all alike, and the trees were all alike, so that if they had left once behind the pool that led them to their own world without making some sort of landmark, the chances would have been 100 to 1 against their ever finding it again. Diggory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut out a long strip of turf on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was a rich reddish brown and showed up well against the green. It's a good thing one of us had sense, said Polly. Well, don't keep on gassing about it, said Diggory. Come along. I want to see what's in the other pools. And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it down. Let's just skip to the moment at which they stood, hard beating hearts, rather scared faces on the edge of the unknown pool with their yellow rings on, and held hands and once more said, 1, 2, 3, go! Splash. Once again it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet and splashed their legs for the second time that morning. If it was morning, it seemed to be always the same time in the wood between the worlds. Blast and botheration, exclaimed Diggory. What's gone wrong now? We put on yellow rings on, all right. He said yellow was for the outward journey. Now the truth was that Uncle Andrew knew nothing about the wood between the worlds. He was quite wrong about the idea about the rings. The yellow ones were not outward rings, and the green ones were not homeward rings, at least not in the way he thought. The stuff of which both were made had come from the wood. The stuff in the yellow rings had the power of drawing you into the wood. It was the stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings is the stuff that's trying to get out of its own place, so that a green ring would take you out of the wood into the world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he did not really understand. Most magicians are. Of course, Diggory did not realize the truth quite clearly enough, or either, not until later. But when they had talked it over, they decided to try the green rings on the new pool just to see what happened. "I'm game if you are," said Polly. But she really said this because in her heart of hearts, she felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of than another splash. I'm not quite sure that Diggory had not the same feeling. At any rate, when they had both put on their greens and come back to the edge of the water and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go, said Diggory, and they jumped.